Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to this press conference today, hosted by the Bruges Group. The Bruges Group, as many of you will know, is a think tank established after a speech by Margaret Thatcher, our first president. And one of the key issues for the Bruges Group is the issue of freedom and democracy. Now, leaving the European Union, voting to do that on the 23rd of June, is a freedom issue. It's a civil liberties issue. The European Union has breached many of rights that we've taken for granted in this country for centuries. So if we vote to leave the EU, then of course it's a vote for not just restoring democracy, reinvigorating our economy, but also protecting our civil liberties from the European Union, which through the European Arrest Warrant, the European Investigation Order, and a whole host of other judicial measures is interfering in the legal process of this country. To speak to us, we have Deborah, who is a victim and survivor of the European Arrest Warrant. She's rebuilding her life after her rights were abused by the European Union via the European Arrest Warrant. We also have Jacob Rees-Mogg, Member of Parliament for North East Somerset, who is a campaigner for Britain to leave the European Union and, of course, for people's civil liberties. Jacob will be very well known to you. And, of course, we have, speaking finally, would be Nigel Farage, Member of the European Parliament and leader of the UK Independence Party. First of all, may I introduce Deborah, victim survivor of the European Arrest Warrant.
Thank you very much. Today I'd like to get my point across. Imagine yourself, flick of a switch, your whole life is turned completely upside down. You're taken off. You're put in a foreign prison with horrendous conditions. You are daily watching brutality. The judicial system is totally different from ours. Now, I was on holiday in Spain with my daughter and grandsons. We'd gone to see my father. We had a wonderful holiday. And this was after the year previously I was arrested in Turkey. And I spent a year investigating that, and everyone just put it down to mistaken identity. And then we leave Spain at the end of our holiday, and I was literally just carted off. My daughter was left stranded with my grandsons. They were only 9 months old. And I haven't got a clue what is going on. And I'm asked to go into this room. There's a translator there who translates to me that there is a European Arrest Warrant from France, and I'd been given a 6-year prison sentence, and I was now being extradited to France. Now, 20 years previously, I had been found not guilty. I came back to the UK, forgot all about it. So I just collapsed on the floor. I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. And then I was taken to Madrid, a high security prison. It is a living nightmare. You don't know if you're going to get out. I had a lawyer who basically just said to me when I was taken to the courts, "Oh, just go. They probably just want to question you." And I'm thinking, hold on, they've just told me I've got a 6-year prison sentence. I spent a month there, and no lawyers. You have to pay for your own lawyers. You haven't any idea what's going to happen to you next, and your own prisoners, and that was there. Might as well plead guilty. You're going to be here 2-3 years, maybe 4. That's horrendous. And some people will plead guilty so they can get home. That's something very, very minor. Edmund Appelli He was arrested, coming back to the UK, been to see his parents. His wife was expecting, he's got children, and he gets to Gatwick. He's arrested. Right, there's an EAW, you are being extradited to Italy. He said, I've never been to Italy. Then they tell him there's a murder charge. But apparently what happened was someone had stolen his identity and committed murder. Now, he could prove that he'd never been to Italy. And on the day of that murder, he was in the UK, working as a chef, and he'd signed a chit. So it proved he was here, but because of the European Arrest Warrant, there was nothing the UK could do. We had to rely on Fair Trials International, who have helped many of us. And they constantly spent months negotiating with the Italians to withdraw the European Arrest Warrant. It took 3 years for mine to be removed after I was brought back to the UK. And I'd like to say, don't ever think it can't happen to you. There's cyber crimes, all sorts go. And all of a sudden, overnight, boom, you're being flown off somewhere, and it's rubber stamped. There's no turning back, no evidence. They don't have to produce any evidence at all. And then I'm releasing it. I've never agreed with the European Arrest Warrant. We had laws before we had extradition treaties. There have been extraditions served. Mine, 7.5 months. So, what difference does it make? 7.5 months? It's supposed to be 90. Is it 90 days? It's 90 days, isn't it, for an EAW? What is the point when you can't save innocent people? It not only destroyed me, it destroyed my family, and the same for every other miscarriage of justice. There's loads of us. I don't want to. I want us to pull out the European Arrest, out of the EU. The laws are. You've got prosecutors. You've got corruption. You've got greedy prosecutors who put out an EAW and a fine, and they get that fine. That's in their pocket. And I know that for a fact. Do we do that here? No. Well, Europe overrides our laws. So I just want to make everyone very aware of this, that we are not in control of miscarriages of justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deborah, for that very moving and alarming story about what's happened to you and many other people. Next we'll have Jacob Rees-Mogg, Member of Parliament for North East Somerset. Jacob.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I'm very grateful to the pool television camera that was late, because I was also late and it covered up my shameful tardiness. This is such an important issue because it is one of our fundamental rights that we should be entitled to a fair trial and the assumption of innocence until proved guilty. The right that we have to that goes back to time immemorial. in Magna Carta, where it says that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or disseized of land or outlawed or in any way destroyed, nor will we condemn him, nor will we commit him to prison, excepting by the legal judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, is a confirmation of rights, not the creation of rights. In 1679, when habeas corpus is put through Parliament as an act of Parliament, again, that is a confirmation of rights thought to date back to Anglo-Saxon times. And now, this is at great risk, because a European arrest warrant doesn't have those protections. It doesn't require prima facie evidence. As Deborah was explaining, once the warrant is issued, you're arrested, you're taken away. There doesn't need to be evidence against you. But worse than that, you may be taken off to a country where even the European Union has said that there is corruption in the police and in the judicial system. If you look at the accession documents relating to Croatia and indeed to Romania, there were concerns raised about the ability of those countries to ensure a proper functioning judiciary and an uncorrupt police force. So you could have a corrupt policeman in a distant country with a foreign language insisting that you're arrested and there is no protection for you. You're then arrested and sent off. And the problem with this is not only that it tramples on our most ancient rights, our right to have a free trial, the rule of law that is so important to how our nation is structured, but it also means that you get the argument put for further integration. And the European arrest warrant is an important stepping stone towards a single European criminal law. Let me explain why. Once you have an arrest warrant, once you've got an arrest warrant, I then raise the points about Croatia and Romania and say, well, their justice system isn't the same as ours. I say that if you're charged in many continental countries, there's no trial by jury. The systems are different. In all countries, do you have the right to a translator? Do you have a right to a lawyer? Will you get some form of legal aid to pay for that lawyer? This isn't just. And my argument would be, to restore justice, is that we should pull out of the European Union and of the European arrest warrant. But the argument from Brussels is the precise reverse. It is to say that, yes, my concerns are valid, but therefore we need more Europe. We need a European public prosecutor who will decide whether these arrest warrants are valid. We will need more of a European police force to enforce them and make sure that there is a level playing field. We will need standards of court procedure that equalise out across the European Union how cases like this will be dealt with. But once you have cases like this dealt with according to a certain court procedure, that becomes your court procedure. So the European arrest warrant in isolation is bad because it tramples on our right of habeas corpus. It tramples on our ability to ensure that we are brought before a court in a reasonable time frame, because that is not the law in the European countries that may be arresting us. And as Deborah was saying, it may be us, maybe one of you who's a victim of mistaken identity. And so when that happens, when you are taken away, a writ of habeas corpus in London will do you no good at all. But that if you move to a more continental style of justice, do we keep habeas corpus anyway? Or do we move to a more continental approach? If you bear in mind there are, 3 countries in the European Union that have the common law, and the rest have civil law? The majority surely will be the one that decides how these cases are dealt with. So it is a fundamental threat to our current legal practices and to the common law. And the argument given in favour of it, is that it catches terrorists and paedophiles. Well, that's very important, of course it is. But there are other ways of cooperating that ensure that you can arrest terrorists and paedophiles. We have other systems with other countries of extradition which have a process in the courts and a requirement for prima facie evidence. But what's it then used for? If it were just used for terrorists and for paedophiles, might we be marginally reassured? But you remember the case of the Kings, Mr. and Mrs. King and their child, who was very, very ill. What happened? Mr. and Mrs. King decided that they were not satisfied with the treatment that their child was receiving in a Hampshire hospital. And they thought that better treatment could be found elsewhere. Wouldn't any parent do that? Would anyone think that the health of their child was more important than kowtowing to a bureaucratic power that was meant to help? And then an arrest warrant was produced for them. They were chased halfway across the continent. Mr. and Mrs. King were held in prison whilst their child was taken into foster care for a brief period. Taken from their sick child left alone because of a European arrest warrant. It wasn't used for terrorists or paedophiles. It was to crush an unhappy family facing real difficulty. And so there are things here of the greatest principle. Nullus liber homo. No free man shall be taken or imprisoned or disseised of his land. Our ancient right trampled on. And that's very important to me as somebody who values this great strand of history that runs through our nation's freedoms. But isn't it even more important when you look at the individual cases? People like Deborah, wrongly imprisoned. People like the Kings, wickedly imprisoned. For a European ideal that does not have the same standards, that if it were to have the same standards would undermine the common law, and a system that does not provide justice as we know it. If we leave the European Union, we get out of the arrest warrant. On its own, that would be worth doing.
Thank you, Jacob. Our next speaker, before we go to the questions, is, of course, Nigel Farage, member of the European Parliament, and I'm proud to say a long-term member of the Bruges Group, having first joined us in 1998. Ladies and gentlemen, Nigel Farage.
Well, thank you. I hate to correct the chairman, but actually, I joined the Bruges Group in 1989. That's even before UKIP. So I've been a member of this club longer than any other. Most clubs generally get rid of me in a short space of time. This referendum, we've talked a lot about where laws are made. And the argument from our side is the laws should be made in Westminster. The argument from the other side is we have great influence over the laws that are made in Brussels. What we haven't talked about at all in this referendum is what kind of laws are being made. Now, we have our own common law system, and as Jacob said, from Magna Carta onwards, it's evolved, but it's been based around some very simple but effective principles that protect the individual against the state. The presumption of innocence before guilt. Habeas corpus. They can't bang you up and throw away the key without first producing a charge. And, of course, our right to trial by jury. And all of these things have been absolutely fundamental. Now, look, I've said before, I'm not anti-European. There's an awful lot we can learn from Europe. Lifestyle, food, there are many things we can learn from Europe. But one thing we don't need to learn from Europe is about judicial systems. I am utterly convinced that our common law system, with its protections, is infinitely superior to the form of law that comes across most of the European continent, which, of course, is inquisitorial and places enormous power in the hands of a prosecutor who says you are guilty. And you, as the individual, then effectively have to reverse that burden of proof and show somehow that you're innocent. And I have to say that I have opposed the European Arrest Warrant at every single stage since it first hove into view 15 years ago. I voted against it at every stage in the European Parliament. Interestingly, a young member of Parliament for Witney in 2002 made a very impassioned speech on the subject of the arrest warrant, and David Cameron said in that first debate that he was very, very keen for this to be struck down. How things have changed. It was a Liberal Democrat, Graham Watson MEP, now Sir Graham, who pushed through this profoundly illiberal law. I'm afraid this warrant removes the presumption of innocence before guilt, and it leaves our nationals vulnerable to being extradited without the production of any prima facie evidence at all. And then what it does is it throws out of the window habeas corpus, because any individual is then liable to be left rotting in a foreign prison without facing a proper charge. My view is that it's the first duty of government, it's the first duty of the British government to put the interests of its own people first, and therefore I believe the European Arrest Warrant, frankly, is an abomination. Deborah Dark's case we've heard today. Jacob talked about the heart-wrenching case of the Kings and their sick child. The one case that I've tried to champion over the years, and I did it again and again on Question Time or wherever I could, was the case of Andrew Symeou. Andrew Symeou was a young 18-year-old, finished his A-levels, they'd gone to a Greek island and were doing what young lads after their A-levels do. Something unfortunate happened in a nightclub, not that it had anything to do with Andrew at all. Some friends of his were taken in by the Greek police, subjected to brutality, both physical and mental, and forced to sign a confession. Interestingly, the point about translators was made earlier. There weren't any translators. The form they signed was in Greek, saying that it was Andrew Symeou that had pushed somebody off the stage who subsequently had fallen, hit their head, and died. A warrant was issued for Andrew Symeou to be extradited to Greece. Once a European arrest warrant is issued, and by the way, not necessarily by a judge, but by a prosecutor, and that's a very fundamental point, I think, here. Once that happens, there is nothing the UK courts, authorities, or government can do to protect that individual. So Andrew was taken off to a Greek prison, and you can read in the Fair Trials Abroad handout the kind of appalling conditions that he was in. He was there for 10 months without facing charge. He was then bailed for a further year, and at the end of it, all charges were dropped. This is happening to too many people. Yet, despite all of this, the Home Secretary, Theresa May, opted us back into the European Arrest Warrant when we had the chance last year to get out of it. Interestingly, this debate is not confined just to this country. In Denmark, there was a referendum in December where they have completely opposed Denmark taking part in what is known as the common area of freedom, security and justice within the EU. So the Danes have said, we don't want it, and certainly our position is, we don't want it. You know, we've had extradition with other countries for about 200 years. We already, as a nation, have 90 individual extradition treaties that we're signed up to. There are some that will tell us that the European Arrest Warrant makes us safer. Indeed, BSE, the Remain campaign, in their big leaflet push out around the nation, have been telling us that we're safer with the European Arrest Warrant. But frankly, we're far less safe being in the EU because our doors are open to foreign criminals and indeed even terrorists. So I don't buy that we're safer with the European Arrest Warrant. I actually would argue that our own citizens are subject to being extradited, possibly for offences that aren't even against the law in this nation, and that the whole thing is working very badly. And there's an irony to all of this, and it is that whilst innocent British people have suffered horribly under the European Arrest Warrant, because of the European Convention on Human Rights, we find ourselves as a nation often with an impossible job to extradite people, known murderers, rapists. Even Abu Qatada, it took us 10 years to get rid of Abu Qatada because of the European Convention on Human Rights. So frankly, what has happened is EU membership has thrown our entire legal system up in the air. We're living in a very topsy-turvy world, and those of us that are campaigning for Brexit believe in liberty. We believe, and it's not perfect, but we believe the British judicial system, aided and abetted by sensible extradition treaties, is the right way forward. Thank you.
Right, we'll have some questions now. Please, put your hand up if you want to ask a question, state your name and the organisation that you come from. Who will read first?
Mr Farage and Mr Rees-Mogg on our Revelation today in the Daily Mail that David Cameron is seeking to get help from business to make a case for Remain even before he closed the deal, the so-called deal on EU membership.
Well, I think the Conservatives should answer that, personally.
It's an incredibly important story, and can I congratulate the Daily Mail on getting it? It's outrageous. It is a real scandal, because assuming it's true, as you have within your paper quoted what the Prime Minister said in the House of Commons against what was going on behind our backs, then Parliament was misled. And if Parliament is misled, that is a matter of historically it's led to resignations. And so I think this is a really important story. I think to be organising the Remain campaign when saying that you ruled nothing out, not just to MPs but to the British people, is shocking. And I think we need an inquiry to find out whether this was going on. We need to see the emails from Downing Street. We need the Daily Mail's best friend to cover up, not to be in charge of it, and have somebody genuinely independent. Because if Parliament has been misled, the country has been misled, and faith has been broken with the British people. It is a scandal of the highest order.
Thank you, Jacob. Nigel,
A little to add to that, other than to say, I think increasingly in this referendum campaign, he's looking like dishonest Dave. You know, because he also, at the same time, as he was saying that, you know, he ruled nothing out in terms of how the renegotiation went, then 3 months later tells us that if we leave it could cause World War III. He clearly has been less than honest with virtually everybody, including, clearly, the House of Commons.
Thank you. John Pienaar.
Mr Rees-Mogg, just to be very direct from what you said a moment ago, if it turns out, as you say, this report is accurate, are you saying the Prime Minister should consider resignation?
If the Prime Minister has misled Parliament, that is fundamentally unconstitutional.
And are you therefore in those circumstances?
Well, we've got to find out whether it's true. I'll answer your question if we find out that it's true.
But you're approaching the subject with a question.
But why? I'll
raise the hypothesis.
Why?
If it turns out to be true, should he, in your view, resign?
Why did Profumo resign? Profumo did not resign because he had an affair, but because he misled Parliament. Misleading Parliament is the highest constitutional crime, and so if it can be proved that this has happened, of course, any minister has to go if they've misled Parliament. It's a basic principle of the Constitution. But I do still say if. I'm not calling for this to happen.
Thank you, Jacob. Who will be next?
No, they do one-on-one. It's fine.
Yes, lady on the second row. If you could state your name and where you're from.
My name's Emma. I'm from PA. You briefly touched on an alternative to the European Arrest Warrant. What would you both like to happen if we were to pull out of the EU? How would we move forward with extradition?
Normal extradition treaties. As I said to you, we've had an extradition treaty with France for nearly 200 years. You know, all over the world, governments help each other by extraditing people who are facing very serious charges. But, no British citizen should be extradited anywhere in the world without first a judge seeing if there are serious grounds, prima facie evidence for this to have to happen. You know, if you throw out of the window all of those protections that people have had for centuries, then you've done the country and its people a very grave disservice. There is nothing to stop criminals being extradited. As I said to you, we are already signed up as a nation to 90 separate extradition treaties, but the European Arrest Warrant is fundamentally flawed.
There is a very straightforward way of doing it. The European Union has legal personality and is able to enter into treaties with nations, and it would be possible for the United Kingdom to enter into a treaty with the European Union as a whole to establish a method of extradition. This was raised when the European Arrest Warrant was being brought back into British law, and at that point the position of the European Commission was that it would not, rather than it could not, make a treaty with a member state. If we were not a member state, that objection falls away in its entirety, and therefore to have in an extradition system that maintained the protections as a bilateral agreement between the United Kingdom on the one hand and the European Union on another would be perfectly possible. I think the most sensible way to do it, the supporters of the arrest warrant have said that, well, you'd have to negotiate 27 separate extradition treaties. That's not true, since the European Union developed legal personality, I think, at the Lisbon Treaty, but it may have been earlier. It was at Lisbon, yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, well, I think that...
There's a gentleman there who had...
Oh, sorry, I didn't see you. Oh, yeah, John Dukes on the third row.
John Dukes, I'm a member of the Bruges Group. Your introduction, Robert, about it being a matter of civil liberties and protection for the individual. One is surprised that the left wing, that the Labour Party has gone along with this as it has done. Surely the TUC, surely the Labour Party should be campaigning against the European Arrest Warrant as it stands at the moment.
Absolutely, John. If I can just elaborate on my comments, the European Union and especially its judicial and home affairs involvement and the European Arrest Warrant, it's not liberal, it's not democratic, and any party that believes it's standing up for ordinary people cannot really support the European Union, because it's the European Union that's threatening people's rights, abusing people's civil liberties, carting them off to foreign prisons on very flimsy evidence, sometimes against all aspects of what we would consider justice. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, as Jacob Rees-Mogg spelt out. And the Bruges Group, of course, warned long ago through Lord Denning about the European Union getting involved in these matters and interfering in our legal system. And it's all coming to pass. And this is the European Union encroaching on rights we've taken for granted for centuries. And so on the 23rd of June, we need to vote to leave the European Union to protect our freedoms and our democracy. Thank you.
Very good. Well done, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you to the speakers.
Thank you.